In the accompanying letter to De Docta Ignorantia, Nicholas of Cusa tells us a remarkable story about the origins of his most famous work, written around 1440, so somewhat later than Palamas. The decisive insight behind this work, he writes, came to him during a sea voyage. On his return from Greece, he was struck, quote, as if by a gift from the Father of lights, end of quote, by the realization that the incomprehensible can only be approached incomprehensibly. The context of this experience deserves closer attention. Nicholas was not traveling as a humanist scholar in search of a forgotten wisdom. He was on a diplomatic and ecclesiastical mission. In 1437, the Latin Church was facing a profound crisis. The Council of Basel had become entangled in a conflict over the question of authority. Did ultimate authority reside in the Pope or in the Council as the representative of the whole Church? Nicholas of Cusa himself had been deeply involved in these debates. In a work written around 1430-1433, De Concordantia Catholica, he had sought to imagine a form of ecclesial unity based not on the victory of one party, but on the harmonious coordination of different voices within the one body of Christ. When Pope Eugene IV convened the new council in Ferrara, this crisis broadened into the question of the relationship between East and West. Nicholas joined the delegation sent to Constantinople to invite the Byzantine representatives to participate in the negotiations that would eventually lead to the Council of Ferrara-Florence, a council we discussed before in the last discussion. It was on the return journey from this mission that, according to his own testimony, the insight emerged that would become the Docta Ignorantia. The work marks a decisive turning point in his thought. Here, Nicholas develops themes that would shape all his later philosophy and theology. The limits of discursive reasons, the coincidentia oppositorum, and the conviction that truth cannot be possessed but only approached. This raises a question. What does it mean that this new way of thinking emerged in the context of an encounter between different ecclesial traditions? Is it merely coincidental that the thinker who would teach the Latin West to speak anew about the limits of knowledge and the coincidence of opposites formulated these insights after a journey dedicated to the search for Christian unity? In this lecture, I would like to read Nicholas of Cusa in the light of questions that emerged with particular sharpness in the hesychast controversy and in the thought of Palamas. Not because I believe that both thinkers offer the same answers, but because both seek in different ways and within different contexts to think together God's transcendence and God's self-communication. Perhaps it's therefore not without significance that De Docta Ignorantia was born on the return journey from Constantinople, with the coast of Greece still in sight. That's how he writes it in his letter. What emerges there may not be only a new epistemology. It may also be a new way of thinking about community, a unity that does not abolish difference but presupposes it. Second part, from Basel to a new grammar of community. To understand why participation becomes so important for Nicholas of Cusa, we must return once more to the context from which the Docta Ignorantia emerged. The failure of the Basel Council must have deeply affected him. The search for concord had threatened to turn into a struggle for representation. Different parties claimed to embody the full truth of the Church. What had begun as an attempt to foster communion risked becoming the victory of one perspective over another. Perhaps this experience marks the beginning of a new path in Cusanus' thought. The question is no longer simply how the Church should be organized, but how community is possible when no finite perspective coincides with the fullness of truth. It is precisely here that participation begins to play a decisive role. Truth can no longer be understood as a possession fully embodied in a single authority. Rather, it appears as a reality in which many can share without ever exhausting it. In this context, we should not forget the importance of Dionysius' Areopagita for Cusanus' thought. In Dionysius, apophasis and participation belong together. God's hiddenness is not the opposite of God's self-communication. It is the very condition that makes participation possible. This perspective allows us to read the Docta Ignorantia, learned ignorance, and Divisione Dei, the vision of God, as attempts to develop a grammar of participation, a way of thinking in which truth and communion remain inseparable, without truth ever becoming an object of possession. As you know better than me, Gregory Palamas gives particularly sharp expression to a question that will accompany us in reading Cuza. How can God truly communicate himself to humanity without ceasing to be the hidden God? My aim here is, of course, not to argue a direct historical influence on Nicholas of Cusa, yet the decisive turn in Cusa's thought follows his stay in Constantinople at a time when Palamite theology had already become part of the Byzantine theological landscape. So Palamas can therefore help us to perceive certain dimensions of Cusa's thought more clearly, not because both thinkers offer the same answers, but because each seeks in his own context to think together God's hiddenness and God's self-communication. If Gregory Palamas articulates the question of participation from the reality of deification, we may ask what happens when the Docta Ignorantia is read against the horizon of the same question. How can God's transcendence and his self-communication be taught together? At first sight, the learned ignorance seems to deny participation rather than affirm it. Cusa begins from the conviction that there is no proportion between the finite and the infinite. Finitiat infinitum nulla est proportio. The finite cannot measure or comprehend the infinite. God, as the absolute maximum, therefore eludes every form of conceptual mastery. Yet, this does not lead Cusa to skepticism. Learned ignorance, Docta Ignorantia, is not mere ignorance. It is the insight that thought truly becomes itself only when it recognizes its own limits. The human mind knows not because it possesses truth, but because it knows that truth infinitely transcends it. Already in the very act of knowing, a participatory structure becomes visible. Knowing is not the passive registration of an object placed at a subject's disposal. Rather, It is a movement in which the mind participates in a truth that both precedes and surpasses it. Cusa develops this insight through the notion of measurement. Every human measure remains finite and therefore never coincides with the absolute measure of all things. Truth cannot be possessed, but it can orient the mind. The infinite withdraws from the concept, yet at the same time draws the mind towards itself. One might even say that participation emerged precisely within Docta Ignorantia. Truth reveals itself only in a relationship in which it simultaneously withdraws from appropriation. It appears in participation, yet never coincides with it. It is truly communicated without ever becoming a possession. It is tempting to hear in this an echo of the ecclesial experiences that precedes the writing of De Docta Ignorantia. Whereas different parties in Basel claim to represent the full truth of the Church, Cusa discovers in the structure of knowledge itself that truth never coincides with a single finite articulation. Plurality, therefore, need not appear only as a threat. In this context, Cusa introduced the coincidentia oppositorum. In God, the absolute maximum opposites coincides that finite reason can only hold apart. Reason reaches its limit precisely where the intellect begins to recognize that the highest truth exceeds every distinction upon which discursive thought depends. Coincidentia oppositorum is therefore not a logical puzzle, but a mystical indication of the way in which the finite mind opens itself to the infinite. Read in this way, Cusa does not abandon participation in favor of abstract transcendence. On the contrary, he seeks a form of participation freed from possession, representation, and conceptual mastery. God's transcendence does not signify absence. It is the very condition under which human beings may share in truth. But how does participation become existential? How does it become a lived relationship between God and human being? It is at this point that the later work, De Visione Dei, the vision of God, becomes especially significant. Remarkably, in this work, Cusa begins not with an abstract argument, but with an experiment. He sends the Benedictine monks of Tegernsee, friends of him, an icon of Christ, whose eyes seem to follow every viewer. He then invites them to compare their experiences. Each monk has the impression that Christ's gaze is directed exclusively at him. Yet, as they begin to speak with one another, they discover that the same experience is shared by all. This simple exercise already contains the central intuition of the work. Christ's gaze is both personal and universal. He sees each individual without thereby becoming any less present to the other. Each truly participates in the same gaze without possessing or exhausting it. It is tempting to hear in this a distant echo of the experiences Cusa may have had during his stay in Constantinople. Although we don't have documents about this, but although any direct connection remains speculative, it is difficult to imagine that Byzantine iconographic culture left no impression on him. In the vision of God, the Visione Dei, the icon becomes a pedagogical instrument, not merely an object of contemplation, but an invitation into a way of knowing that unfolds only through participation. The first insight arising from this experience is as simple as it is profound. Before human beings see God, they are already seen by God. The initiative lies not with the human spirit striving towards the divine, but with a gaze that already encompasses and sustains it. Participation here proves to be more than epistemological relationship to truth. It becomes a relationship in which human beings discover themselves to be addressed by a presence that precedes them. From this experience, Cusa leads his readers towards what may be the climax of the work, the wall of paradise. He calls this wall the wall of the coincidentia oppositorum. It marks the point at which discursive reason reaches its limit. Beyond it stands God, who transcends every opposition and therefore escapes every attempt at conceptual appropriation. At first sight, this wall appears to confirm God's inaccessibility, and yet it does not constitute an absolute separation. Cusanus describes it as a threshold that can be crossed by grace, precisely where understanding comes to halt, a new mode of participation becomes possible. Here we may return briefly to the question that has accompanied us through Palamas. How can God's transcendence be preserved without losing the reality of communion? Cusa does not resolve the tension. Rather, he inhabits it. God's hiddenness proves not to be an obstacle to communion with God, but its very condition. The wall protects the mystery from becoming our possession. Yet precisely for that reason, the relationship remains alive. God truly gives himself without ceasing to be the hidden God. Human beings truly participate in the divine life without ever being able to dispose of God. What was articulated epistemologically in De Docta Ignorantia now takes on a spiritual form. Participation does not abolish the distinction between God and human being. Rather, it transforms human beings precisely through their receptivity. If this is so, the question of ecclesial communion takes on a new significance. If no one possesses the truth, but all participate in a truth that transcends them, how should the communion of the Church be conceived? With this question, we return to the ecclesiological horizon with which our reflection began. And now I come to the conclusion. With this brief rereading of Nicholas of Cusa in the horizon of Palamas and the Council of Ferrara, Florence, has sought to show is that Cusa does not attempt to resolve theoretically the tension between God's hiddenness and God's self-communication. God's transcendence remains truly transcendent. Participation remains truly participation. In the Docta Ignorantia, participation appears as a way of thinking that learns to acknowledge its own finitude and precisely for that reason becomes open to a truth that transcends it. In the Visione Dei, you can hear already in this title nice ambiguity. It's God's vision and our vision of God. The same insight takes on a spiritual form. Human beings discover themselves to be already encompassed by a gaze that precedes and sustains them. Truth does not appear here as an object to be possessed. It reveals itself in participation itself, while always exceeding every individual participation. The truth in which we participate never coincides with its finite articulation, and precisely for that reason, it remains a source of transformation and communion, opening up a path toward deification that is defined by a receptive relationship rather than conceptual possession. Perhaps Cusa thereby reminds us that even within the Latin tradition, other paths remained possible. The human mind is not a producer or master of truth, but a participant in a truth that sustains it while infinitely surpassing it. When Nicholas of Cusa writes, this decisive insight was granted to him off the coast of Greece, we need not understand this merely as a reference to the rediscovery of Greek philosophy. It may also point towards a way of thinking in which truth and participation, transcendence and communion, hiddenness and self-disclosure are no longer opposed to one another as alternatives. In this sense, Cusa's return journey from Constantinople remains an unfinished invitation to dialogue, not only between East and West, but also between different ways of understanding what it means to participate in a truth that no one possesses, and that precisely for that reason can give itself inexhaustibly.